I'm Adam Klein of the Strauss Center on International Security and Law. We are one of the co-sponsors of the Intelligence Studies Project, along with our partners at the Clements Center. Thank you all so much for being here today and for joining us, both for the career fair and for the excellent remarks that we've had thus far. I just want to say on behalf of the Strauss Center, and I know our colleagues share this sentiment, we are very proud to be part of a university that supports national security, that is proud to partner with the agencies of the U.S. government, and to give our employers here a warm welcome and the opportunity to connect with our students. I know that the chance to talk to these employers means the world to them, so if you are one of the employer representatives, thank you for being here and for taking the time. It makes a big difference. This panel is an opportunity for you to engage with some of the top experts in the nation on the issues that are ripped from the headlines in geopolitics today. I'll very briefly introduce them. Assistant Secretary Holmgren, who's already been introduced. We're very delighted to have him here. I'll let your previous introduction stand for itself. We also have General Vince Brooks, who retired from active duty as the 4-star general in command of all U.S. forces in Korea, which I believe also encompasses the United Nations Command in Korea. He also served as Deputy Director of Operations and primary spokesman for U.S. Central Command during the Iraq War, a pivotal moment, obviously, when the eyes of the world were focused on that role. He's a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and holds a Master of Military Art and Science from the Army School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth. And we're also delighted to have him affiliated with the Strauss and Clements Centers here at UT Austin. Professor Sheena Chestnut Greitens is Associate Professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at UT Austin. She is also a fellow with both the Clements Center for National Security and, of course, my own Strauss Center on International Security and Law. And she is one of the leading experts in our nation on East Asia, especially China and Korea in particular, authoritarian politics and American national security most broadly. Her first book was Dictators and Their Secret Police: Coercive Institutions and State Violence, which was recognized with the Best Book Award from the International Studies Association. She's currently working on 2 research projects, one on China's internal security policies and another on authoritarian diasporas, particularly focused on North Korea. We're delighted to have them today, and I would encourage you, please begin formulating your questions now. I've seen a few of my students in the audience. I'm expecting a spot-on, brilliant question from each of you, or else we'll be talking about it in class. But we really want this to become a Q&A and an interactive exchange with our panelists here today. I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists to do something that people in policy really hate to do, which is prioritize. If you could rank order, and this includes everything, the war in Ukraine, the Taiwan crisis, counter-terrorism, economic, statecraft, and technological challenges, what are the biggest threats to the United States today? If only one thing is keeping you up at night, what is it? And we'll start with you, Professor Greitens.
Oh dear, okay, thanks. So this is also something that many academics don't love to do, so I appreciate that you've given us a question that none of us probably want to necessarily field today. So I think that the biggest long-term threats to United States interests globally do come from the People's Republic of China. If you look at the ability to pose a long-term competitive threat or to hold at risk key American interests across the economic, security, democracy and human rights, technology, domains, China very quickly rises to the top of each of those lists. That's not to say, I think, that there aren't other really acute and urgent security challenges. So if you asked me what the most urgent national security issue facing the United States was, I would have said Russia and Ukraine. But if you think about the most serious, sustained, long-term challenge that requires sort of reorganization and rethinking of U.S. security strategy, priorities, procurement, et cetera, then I would see that very much as focused on China.
General Brooks?
I'm going to give you a bit of an abstract answer on this and not pick an external concern, but rather what I believe is the greatest existential concern for us, and that is a coupled sense of isolationism, a rising potential spirit of isolationism in the United States, and the absence of domestic tranquility. So when you couple the two of those, we end up signaling to the international community and to countries like China, especially, who have peer capability and are on the move globally, that we're not on the move globally, that we are retreating, we are receding, we are retrenching, pick whatever reverse term you would like, And that sends the wrong message. It emboldens and empowers countries around the world and other actors to think that there's now room to pursue things that are not in the interest of the United States. And so I would say that's our biggest concern. That's just my view.
So I would just start by saying, obviously, we live in a time of unprecedented challenges across the nation. And as I look out over the long run, there's no question that the People's Republic of China poses the most serious long-term challenge to U.S. interests into the future. Militarily, technologically, economically, they are the only nation that has, as my colleague referenced, I think real capacity to challenge the international system as we know it, and increasingly the intent to do so. And so this involves things like the rules-based international order that has provided for peace and security for over 7 decades and has in fact enabled China to rise. So that is why China is an unparalleled priority for the intelligence community. It is here in INR. But in the near term, again, Russia is an example of a weak and declining power that can still be quite dangerous and quite deadly. And so we can't lose focus of that. Zooming out more broadly, there are a number of other kind of a bucket of challenges that I would put climate change, which I actually think is an existential threat to our society and to civilization if we don't address it. Infectious diseases, which can lead to millions of deaths and impact domestic politics across the world. Can't take our eye off of terrorism. And then the continued proliferation of WMDs. There's a bucket of things, transnational challenges that may not seem immediate today, but the minute we take our eye off of it, it is going to be a significant challenge for us.
So all of 3 of the speakers, I think this is telling, ranked China as the preeminent long-term threat, strategic competitor, systemic challenger to the United States. So I think it's appropriate that we start with that. And I will ask each speaker a question about China within your own area of expertise. So I'll start again with Professor Greitens, going in order here.
This is a good order, too. I like that. It's very good.
Closest first. And I hope we can talk about something that maybe Americans miss, which is internal dynamics within China. And so I hope you can enlighten us. What do you think people who are interested in China but maybe don't know as much about how the system and society are evolving internally should know but don't know about those topics?
That's a great question. I think there are a couple of things that are going on inside China today that are really consequential, but that are hard for a lot of Americans and external observers of China writ large to understand, in part because of the opacity of the Chinese political system. And so one of the things that's important that came up briefly in the conversation with the congressman earlier is that China is approaching the 20th Party Congress later this fall. It's been set for a date in October, at which Xi Jinping is expected to assume a 3rd term, which is relatively unprecedented in the sort of post-reform and opening, the post-Mao period and post-Deng Xiaoping period among China's leaders. But he's actually doing so in what I would describe as maybe more difficult circumstances than I expected a year ago. If you look at what's gone on with China's own economy, with the slowing of the global economy, the slowing of the Chinese economy, if you look at the impact of zero COVID, which I think for political reasons the Chinese leadership is determined to maintain through November, and possibly maybe locked into next year because of the relative pace of vaccine development inside China and sort of variant evolution in the virus, that's proven to be a pretty costly strategy for them, but one that they seem politically locked into and unable to change. And then you have an external environment that, we tend to look at China and we see aggregate power. Chinese leaders tend to look at their growth and see all of the cracks in the foundation or the areas where they feel like they're still not where they would like to be. And so there are things like not only the problems with the economy, but we don't know much about the stability of elite politics. And then there are also, some questions about whether or not China's role in the world is producing a lot of global pushback. And so especially in light of the Ukraine crisis, which I think we'll probably talk more about soon, Xi Jinping put a very personal stamp on this relationship with Russia, and it's unclear exactly how much China knew. As Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, has pointed out, Russia has a habit of maybe not being super forthcoming and lying about its plans about Ukraine, and may have done that with China or may have only partially read them in to what was about to happen. But the effect for China was that you had the leadership put its stamp on a partnership that almost immediately was at odds with what China says its principles are, with its desire to have continued economic growth or at least economic stability, which means you can't violate sanctions. So really put some key pressure on some important choices for China, and I think we've seen China really a bit on its back foot trying to navigate, okay, we're going to be rhetorically sort of all in for our partnership with Russia, but on actual behavior, and we're going to keep our military relationship pretty steady, but we're going to talk about expanding economic cooperation, but not in a way that will get us in hot water on sanctions. And that's been a pretty delicate and in some cases not entirely consistent balance, or straddle as one of my colleagues has referred to it as. So I think what we're seeing in China is that there is this important leadership transition. It's a break from the last sort of 15 years of the way that Chinese elite politics has functioned. Xi Jinping is trying to do something unusual as the preeminent leader, and he's doing it in conditions that if you're sitting in Beijing, maybe don't look as favorable or as good as we sometimes see for China when we look at it from the outside and China looks 10 or 20 feet tall.
General Brooks, a simple question. How do you assess the military balance between the United States and the People's Republic of China in the Western Pacific?
Yeah, this is a very interesting one, and it's first a matter of, if you begin to compare things, you'll find that China has outpaced the U.S. in its growth of military capabilities. As you heard the Congressman talk about, hypersonics are just one example, but there are many others. Their proliferation of missile technologies, how many different types of missiles they produce, their nuclear capabilities, the size of their conventional forces, the growth of the People's Liberation Army Navy, its strategic forces that control its nuclear forces, all this, the growth is significant. Yet, I met a few years ago, back in 2014, one of the last People's Liberation Army senior leaders who had actual combat experience. And he had it as a very junior officer against Vietnam back in the 1970s. So they have no combat experience. And that matters. It will matter a lot in terms of why they need to have a lot of stuff. Because if they are up against a peer like the United States with a much more sophisticated approach to military operations, they're likely to pay a more significant butcher's bill. So numbers and technology will not be enough, and I think there's certainly clear evidence of that as we look at Russia against Ukraine. That is not enough. There has to be something in the moral dimension, the human dimension of military capability, and they're short on that. They're yearning for it. Interestingly, I talked to one People's Liberation Army major. We were having lunch, that same general, and I asked her why she chose to be an infantry officer. And she says, because I want to experience combat. And I looked at her and said, be careful what you ask for, okay? Because combat is not something you should ever crave. Every warrior wants to, of course, and I certainly did as a junior officer to make sure I was worthy of my medal. But the reality is the cost is a very significant one, and it can be an existential one. It could mean the end of the People's Republic of China. Let me just dovetail on one last point that goes to the part of the question you asked, Sheena. We have to recognize that the Chinese Communist Party is the instrument that's accreting all this power and control. And that isn't necessarily reflective of the Chinese people and where they would want to go, especially as they have a generational change that's ongoing. In the early years of Xi Jinping, his efforts were to clean out corruption, to get rid of the princelings who were automatically inheriting power, and to address the military influences inside of that arena as well. So many of the military leaders were very concerned about their survival in his first few years. Well, most of that's been moved out of the way now, so he's already consolidated power. But the protection of the Chinese Communist Party in the eyes of the people is the most valuable thing that I think that Xi Jinping is trying to pursue. And depending on how he maneuvers, on economic issues domestically, on societal issues domestically, and even how he operates on the international stage, that will determine whether or not he has a following, even when he gets an unprecedented third term. So I think that's important to understand as well, as thinking through what is the vulnerability that exists inside of China as we look at them militarily and domestically.
Thank you. And Assistant Secretary Holmgren, as you all know, one of the key tasks of intelligence analysis is to provide warning about things like a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So can you shed some light on how analysts in the intelligence community at INR go about forecasting events like that are such high consequence, but that obviously the adversary is taking steps to deceive us about or to disguise?
Sure. So I'd say the challenge in Taiwan is not unique, obviously, to how the intelligence community provides strategic warning for a range of other potential conflicts. And I think the analysis and the collection and the declassifying and downgrading intelligence in the lead up to Russia's further invasion of Ukraine this February is a great example. And I've said before, I think it will go down as one of the intelligence community's greatest achievements, right up there with finding bin Laden, now finding Zawahiri, Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of uncovering those missile silos in Cuba. So I think history will reflect that was an incredible strategic warning that the community did. And analysts are looking at all sources of intelligence on a daily basis. And in the context of China and Taiwan, I think they're doing their jobs the same way they would for, frankly, any other challenge.
Maybe for those who aren't familiar with that analytic process,
yeah.
What are some of the things that analysts will look at to try as signals of a potential action?
Look at everything from overhead imagery of, for instance, how the Chinese may be moving naval assets around in or near the Straits or the South China Sea. They'll pick up any human sources and collection that we may have of agents around the world that can report on the plans and intentions of the PRC with respect to Taiwan. Of course, signals intercepts of anything that may bear on those issues. I'd say increasingly, as we are doing in INR, looking at really valuable information that's available in the open source space. And there's a lot of it to include, really important writings from Chinese academics and other government officials who are, providing information publicly that we, find of value just to glean insights into their thinking.
Staying with Assistant Secretary Holmgren, and just harking back to a point that General Brooks made a moment ago about the possibility that wars can upend regimes. And of course, we saw that after World War I, where several imperial dynasties that had ruled for centuries were toppled by their country's travails during that conflict. Shifting over to Russia here, we've seen in the past few days, I think most of us would say fortunately, an almost miraculous, very successful offensive in the north of Ukraine by Ukrainian troops. Russian forces, in some cases, fleeing, leaving significant stocks of equipment behind. It's far too soon to say that this portends a complete defeat of Russian forces, but that has to be taken seriously at this point. And so looking at the potential dominoes that might fall if Russia is indeed defeated, I'd ask, how do you assess the possibility of some of these contingencies? Russian forces collapsing, President Putin escalating in some kind of drastic way, including tactical nuclear weapons to avoid defeat. You mentioned looking at other countries' doctrine. Russian military theorists have famously or infamously published a doctrine called escalate to de-escalate, using tactical nukes to effectively say back off or we'll go further. If that happens, if Putin falls, hypothetically, what will follow, and how is the intelligence community thinking about the possibilities of succession? Is that something you regard with anticipation? I know you can't talk about policy preferences, or is that something that we should be worried about potentially? Yeah. And then one last thing to throw onto your plate there in the mixer, the energy crisis in Europe this winter. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about industrial companies shutting their doors across Central and Eastern Europe because of the lack of natural gas.
Sure.
Easy setup.
So look, with just on the ground right now, the Ukrainians have the momentum, and they have the wind at their back. And that is due to the incredible willpower and the capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces and people. Having said that, this is a grinding war of attrition, and Russia still illegally occupies more Ukrainian territory today than it did in February. But there's no question the Ukrainians, have the momentum at this point in the conflict. Another point I'd make is that, Putin has achieved exactly the opposite of what he set out to do in Ukraine. So if you just zoom way out and look at what he's accomplished, the war in Ukraine has turned into a quagmire for the Russian military. It has exposed significant weaknesses in capabilities, training, leadership. NATO is more united. There are now Sweden and Finland on the verge of membership. The Western alliance is more united around Ukraine than it was. Russia's economy is worse off than before the war started, and Russia is isolated diplomatically around the world. So that's important because I think Putin has underestimated, first, the Ukrainian people. He underestimated the resolve of the West and the international community to stand up to naked aggression and to an attempt to change this rules-based international order. And I think he's underestimating the willpower of the Ukrainian people and of the Western alliance to maintain our commitments to Ukraine moving forward. And so it's tough to draw parallels in terms of what this means for Russia, but Putin's Afghanistan, the magnitude of the consequences in this context could be far greater. But I think it's worth just reflecting a little bit historically on kind of what that could mean for the military. With respect to the energy crisis, and you have to remind me of a couple of the other questions in between. Look, Putin using energy as a weapon is not a novel thing, unfortunately, and he's given all indications publicly that he's going to cut off oil and natural gas supplies to Europe, potentially later this fall if there's a price cap instituted. Obviously, that would cause real harm to families and communities across Europe as we head into winter. So again, he's using energy to impact civilians across the continent in really destructive ways. I think I'll go back. The last point I'll make, and let me know if I missed a question, just in terms of Russia and how to think about this right now, is that nations that are declining can still be quite dangerous. And leaders, when they become desperate, can make unwise and irresponsible choices. So in the intelligence community in INR, we're laser focused on watching Russia's nuclear force posture to detect any changes that would cause alarm, obviously for the international community. But it is, frankly, it is irresponsible that we're even having this discussion about a state using a nuclear weapon in the 21st century. And I think it's irresponsible for the Russians to even threaten the use of such things publicly.
And thank you, Annette. You covered 8 out of 10 parts
All right.
of my 10-part
really
question.
well done.
So the last point is regime stability in Russia, and how should we think about a possible succession if indeed this does become a humiliating debacle and that ultimately brings down Putin?
So, look, we're looking at all the pillars of stability in Russia, which is, support among, for the regime, among the security forces, the economy, and then the public support for the people. So I'm not going to get into our assessments of where those things stand, but we're watching it very closely, and I think there are parts of the Russian economy that we're beginning to see the signs of the effects of the sanctions and export controls, and I think those impacts, our view is that, especially as it pertains to industrial production, over the next year or so, the ability of Russia to manufacture parts and supplies that they need to replenish and to restock and repair badly damaged equipment, that's going to become more difficult the longer this conflict drags on, as they're unable to produce those parts and capacities internally. Like they're having a hard time right now being able to, repair commercial aircraft because they don't have the parts they need. So I think as we look out over the horizon, those are the types of things that we'll look at.
Thank you, and that's of course a great harks back very nicely to our discussion about chips and the importance of semiconductors for defense applications earlier, something that the university is very involved in helping with. General Brooks, one thing that we talk about here with the Strauss Center and Clements Center often is the importance for students interested in national security of understanding military affairs, even if you do not intend to join the military yourself. Of course, Bismarck said, history is made by blood and iron, and on the ground here in Ukraine, it's the Russian military's poor performance and the heroic performance of Ukraine, supported by the West and especially the United States, that is making all the difference. So how do you, as a military leader and of course an expert in land power, assess why the Russian military has failed so badly and what lessons that might hold for us and for other countries as we look at our own military posture?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. And I do ascribe to the idea that you should study the use of the military instrument, what its limitations are, how it works best in partnership with other instruments to be most effective. And for those who are military in the room or that will be military, make sure you're studying much more than the military instrument. And so understanding how all of these fit together is very important, and that is probably the first place of failure for Russia. In many ways, Russia was operating in a 1930s type of mentality in terms of the approach to the use of military force. And there was a time when that approach was the most advanced. They had lots of doctrine that was emerging in the 1930s that set the tone for most other modern militaries up until about the 1990s. So their theorists were certainly on target a long time ago, but their practitioners have lost the art form in many ways. For example, using military power as a compellence weapon against populations in order to drive decisions by government officials. That's an old-fashioned method that we almost thought was free from the world. It's no longer being used, but it is. It is still being used, and Russia's demonstrated that. So the degree of destruction they've engaged in is intended to compel, to break will, and to lead to a decision on the part of national leaders that says, we can't take the pain anymore, I don't want this suffering to continue, I capitulate. And that's not what happened. And so the Ukrainian will has to be factored in, and it's one of the very important lessons of what happens in military operations. It's the role of will. Why is it that the Iraqi security forces couldn't stand against the Islamic State? It has nothing to do with their military capability. It has everything to do with national will. The same thing with the Afghan National Army. A feeling of being betrayed by decisions that were being made in Doha, Qatar, led to an erosion of will. It has nothing to do with their military capability. And so we shouldn't get enamored with counting things, but rather trying to assess the moral level of any adversary that we would face, and candidly, building our own moral level so that our nation can withstand the butcher's bill. If we're finding ourselves squaring off with a peer competitor like China over Taiwan, I'll give you that as an example, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit later on Taiwan's real value, but certainly one of its values is to draw the U.S. into a fight that exacts a significant butcher's bill, gives them the combat experience they want, reduces the amount of military capability that the United States has to bring to bear as China would pursue other options on a much larger geopolitical basis. If that is true, how do we make sure that we are able to withstand that butcher's bill as a nation, to get beyond the point of injury to now the point of counterattack, to be able to restore advantage? This is what leadership is all about, and it has to be developed in any nation, politically and militarily. So for those of you who might not be going into the military, if you haven't studied the art form, you won't be one of those political leaders who can make the right decisions on the use of the instrument, to know what success looks like. Simple examples of how long do you need to stay if you've actually gone into a given country to try to stabilize it. How long does that last? Brooks says half of a century, minimum. 50 years, that's how long it takes to stabilize a country. 20 years, our nation appeared to be fatigued, sending a very bad message that we can't hang for more than 20 years, which was halfway through the process. Next time you go home and bake a cake, pull it out halfway through and see how well you like it. It's not done yet. It's not finished. So we have to understand that there are limitations to military capacity, that there also are things that come with an investment of military capacity, and they work best when they're in concert with other instruments, economic power, information, intelligence. The Assistant Secretary talked about the use of information to declassify intelligence and push out, essentially taking the narrative away from Russia well in advance of their operations, which helped to galvanize European countries to recognize that there was in fact a storm coming and that they needed to stand firmly against that. That was very important. I completely agree with your point that it's historic in the approach. That is one of the instruments. And so how these are used in concert then impacts the way the military is used when it's all said and done and what it needs to be comprised of.
Thank you. I think that's such a powerful point, and it nicely connects back the discussion of preemptive declassification, which utterly stripped the legitimacy from everything Russia tried to do and the pretext that it tried to create. And we've all seen how that sense of illegitimacy has powerfully mobilized the international community. So it is the day after the anniversary of 9/11. We were supposed to have Dr. Michelle Malvesti, a CT expert of 20 years, 30 years standing, up here to talk to us about that. She's not here, but I don't want to let it pass unremarked, given that it is such an important milestone and was obviously such a searing moment in all of our lives. And so for all three of you, particularly starting with the Assistant Secretary and with General Brooks, and then I have a different question for you as an East Asia expert. What is the legacy of our post-9/11 counterterrorism efforts, what we used to call the global war on terrorism, with the benefit of 21 years hindsight? What good lessons can we take from it? And what bad lessons can we take from it? And I hope you'll each be candid enough to give one of each. And then for you, Professor Greitens, you've said to me before that China has a different view of terrorism than we do. And how does China's view of terrorism inform its internal and external policies? Maybe start with you, Professor Greitens.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that I would direct anybody who's interested in this question about how China views terrorism is the recent report by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights on what is happening today in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is the region in China's far west that is predominantly composed of Turkic Muslim populations, mostly the Uyghurs, but a handful of other ethno-religious minorities as well. Where China has set up the largest internment campaign of an ethno-religious minority since World War II, that two successive U.S. administrations have deemed meet the bar or the threshold for genocide, and that the United Nations High Commissioner said likely qualify for the under international law as crimes against humanity. One of the things that the report does really well is to take on this argument that what China is doing in Xinjiang is counterterrorism and say, yeah, you may see it that way. There are still standards about international law and human rights that have to be met that are being blatantly and flagrantly violated here. So I think China has a lot of concerns about domestic stability, and it may be worth coming back to this because I think those concerns actually drive much of China's grand strategy and its foreign policy today, and that we may be about to see a pretty significant shift in how China approaches these questions in world politics because of some of the domestic security factors that are playing out around Xi Jinping's assumption of a third term. But as it relates to terrorism, in 2017, China used this, what Xi Jinping calls a comprehensive national security concept, to say, okay, we have to be more proactive, more preventive, and started comparing terrorism to a virus. And if you actually take that metaphor to its logical conclusion, that means inoculating the population means that you are detaining and treating with coercive political re-education and massive amounts of repression people who've done nothing to deserve it. Right? You don't immunize people usually after they have a virus. We generally immunize or vaccinate people beforehand, but that's a clear violation of any standard of proportionality or the expectations that we have of human rights in the world and under international law today, including a lot of agreements that China says it subscribes to. So China has this claim that what's happening in Xinjiang is terrorism, but the framework that it's advanced in this use of a virus metaphor mean that that the solutions that it has come up with for this problem mean that it is targeting innocent civilians completely indiscriminately on the basis of normal religious practice and ethnicity. And so I think that that's hugely problematic. It's hugely problematic in part because of the way in which China has started to argue to revise the normative order of the international system. And I think we're about to see much more of that. But I'll pause there rather than going into the details on that. I think that that sort of normative attempt to justify certain actions under this framework of terrorism is both outdated and just, when you actually look in practice, really at odds with international law.
Great. General Brooks, maybe one lesson, one good lesson and one bad lesson.
There are really a lot of lessons, and I'll try to distill it down. I talked about the joining of different capabilities. The post 9/11 era drove us to break down stovepipes and bureaucratic walls that blocked the sharing of information and the approach to fusion. And so we now have a much more fused approach when we are focused on a particular problem. And that translates all the way down into military units. The U.S. military's joint operations, that is the unified action of Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force, cyber operations, special operations, and even Coast Guard under certain circumstances, is a very advanced art form now. It's very advanced. It's something that you did not see Russia portray, and it's something that China does not possess. And so we have to keep that competitive advantage through this approach to jointness in our operations that is reflective of an integrated and fused approach of different instruments of government. That was a plus that came out of that era. And we're set apart at this point in time from most of the world. That's fleeting, but it's certainly the case. The downside is, I'd say that a failure to really capture the lessons of what it means to consolidate gains. Some of the gains will be military, some of the gains will be economic, societal. There were lots of gains that were made. And I don't think we've drawn the right lessons from why were we not able to hang on to that in Iraq and Afghanistan. They may eventually emerge, but they will emerge on their own course with some support and some influence from the United States, but mostly on their own course without actual presence and shoulder-to-shoulder impacting in what I call the exporting of professionalism, which happens when you're in close proximity with somebody else. The professionalism of the United States is exportable, and it directly seeps into those that we work and stand beside. But if we fail to do that, then we fail to consolidate the gains made. And I don't know that we've come to the right conclusions on what does it take then to consolidate gains once we've invested ourselves into something or some place. How do you make sure you don't lose what you achieved? And those lessons are yet to be drawn out.
So I would agree with many of the points the General made, and I would just say, I think on the positive side, yes, breaking down the silos within our own government to share information, not only within the intelligence community, but also with our state and local partners and our key partners and allies overseas is another big area that has had a tremendous impact on empowering and foreign partners to take some of these actions themselves. The other point I would make is that you have a whole generation of intelligence officers who grew up and came in literally after 9/11 that have, this is the, counterterrorism was the thing that they learned. That was the new tradecraft. That was their area of focus. And I think, at least on the analytics side, although I think on the operations side you see this as well, you've got a generation of analysts who are now trained and just have natural instincts to write assessments for a broader purpose. So yes, they're going to answer the policy questions, but they also have an eye towards how can analysts be responsive to operational needs while still maintaining that objectivity? How can they help identify opportunities for policymakers, whether it's diplomatically or on the military side of things? I think you've got this generation of analysts who just think a little bit differently about what it means to provide objective intelligence.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions here. I, of course, have plenty, as you can tell, and maybe I'll combine them all into one, but if we have some hands, I think this is a great opportunity to get you all involved. Maybe back there for the first one. And we really love to have our students getting involved in the Q&A as well.
Hi, so Assistant Secretary Holmgren, earlier you mentioned that the INR was the only member of the IC to dissent on the 2002 Iraq WMD issue. I was wondering what you think differentiated the INR process to come to a dissenting and ultimately correct view on this, and how you think the IC has evolved and improved since that time to hopefully avoid this type of failure in the future.
Sure. So thank you for recognizing that important and historic contribution of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And, you know, I wasn't around at that time, so I'm just opining based on where I sit now and what I've heard from folks who were actually around at that time. But my sense is that there's a huge cultural component to to INR and to organizations generally, but especially to INR. And that in INR, it's a culture of independence, of deep expertise on the issues, and speaking truth to power. And I think that was embodied in their willingness to stand up for, you know, a minority view at the time in 2002, and to hold the line. And I think that's because of this culture of independence that is like ingrained in the fabric of the institution. So bringing that forward to where we are today, you know, there's a lot of focus that D&I Haynes has put on really making sure that we institutionalize, you know, analytic objectivity, and that we always keep politics out of anything that the intelligence community does. And so in INR, that is translated into us establishing our first analytic ombudsperson earlier this year. And that role is now enshrined in our governance, you know, kind of documents and procedures. And that person has the authority to serve as a confidential channel for analysts or other officers in INR if they ever feel like they're under any political influence or pressured to write a certain way or to provide a certain viewpoint. They can now use our analytic ombudsperson to seek guidance on next steps and counseling, and if needed, to go to the to the inspectors general as appropriate. So I think institutionalizing both a culture of independence and freedom of thought, and also a culture of support at the top. Leaders, right? They have to support their analysts if they're going to stand up for what they believe in. As long as those dissents are well reasoned and supported by good evidence or good analysis, I think it's a leader's responsibility then to to stand behind their folks.
Great question. Okay, we'll go there first. I see the gentleman in the green sweater here.
General, how concerned are you with the survivability of our aircraft carriers?
Aircraft carriers, okay. I'm very concerned, especially as we face the kind of threats that China has developed, the anti-ship missile systems in particular, that can be devastating to our aircraft carriers and any other vessels for that matter. This is what I was alluding to when I speak of the butcher's bill. So when you stand toe-to-toe with a peer, they have the ability to bring you to an end in significant ways. We have to be mentally prepared. I'm not trying to sound doom and gloom here. We just must be mentally prepared and completely eyes wide open that if we get engaged in direct combat with the People's Liberation Army, they have systems that at the outset, while they possess them, will be used against us in a way to create the most devastating effect they can while they can, knowing that there's a matter of time before the U.S.'s momentum will overtake what it is that they have the ability to do. So going after things that can project power or that are symbolic to the American sense of success, like aircraft carriers, would be one of the first things they would go after. And they've designed weapon systems for that purpose. We are potentially going to see the kinds of losses that we haven't seen since the Battle of Okinawa, where the United States Navy suffered the greatest amount of casualties. Okay, that's when kamikaze showed up and other things that were going on as well. The cost to the Navy of losing entire ships companies in a devastating attack we haven't experienced in the generations that currently lead, and certainly perhaps even the generations that live. That's something I believe we've got to be sober about, absolutely sober about. Now, what do we do about it? So we develop tactics jointly so the carriers are not by themselves, so that strike can occur before carriers advance. This is where the idea of things like multi-domain operations comes in, whatever term you want to use it. But each different domain, the cyber domain, the surface domain of land forces, the air domain, can impact the domains that would threaten our maritime forces. And how we work together ends up being able to make it much more difficult for even a peer competitor to get the advantage. That's why we have to stay on edge.
We had this gentleman over here and then some more questions there.
Thank you so much for an excellent panel and for all the work you do. General, thank you for that comment. My dad was actually in the Navy off of Okinawa when that was taking place. And thinking of partners, what do you see as the role of Japan in this entire scenario? Thinking of China.
In a Taiwan scenario, well, certainly it opens potential and existential threat to Japan. Proximity first, affinity second, and what it then means to Japan. It would be a catalytic event in many ways that would cause Japan to have to completely rethink their post-World War II policies, doctrine, and stance. And they're having to have these debates even now, but that would be a catalyst that would drive them to having to choose a different course of action at that point in time. And so they have great interest in what happens there, and especially in prevention of a crisis occurring. How do you then organize the Japanese self-defense forces? Should they be allowed to preempt if they see something that's going to be threatening to the southwest portion of the Japanese archipelago, and then from there potentially deeper? Or to isolate Japan by penetrating beyond the Japanese archipelago into the areas east and south of Japan? What happens if the Philippines fall? All these things are a concern to the Japanese. And as a result, they must think larger than the archipelago, and yet stay pacifistic in their fundamental design. And they do that through relationship building throughout the region. You know, interestingly, back in 2004, I was traveling through Asia as part of a military senior leader development program. And as we hit several different countries in Southeast Asia, one of the questions that I asked each one of them, and we were meeting with senior level leaders, is what is the biggest concern you have, or what is the biggest wild card that you are facing? I was expecting to hear, potential resurgent Japan or rearmed Japan. I only heard that in China. Everywhere else said the unpredictability of the United States. And so Japan must then hedge because of the unpredictability of the United States. And they do that through developing relationships throughout the region. That's how I see it.
One right here, gentleman in the black shirt.
Yes, I'd like to address Mr. Holmgren in particular, and maybe the entire panel, just coming back to the whole idea of politicization of the foreign policy establishment and the intelligence community. I mean, we did see 6 years ago, the Steele dossier, let's face it, is mostly invalid claims. So there was, in fact, much politicization in 2016 with the Clinton campaign making invalid charges against collusion with Russia. Also, 2 years ago, we saw the Hunter Biden laptop controversy. So I reject all deep state conspiracies, and I reject Donald Trump, but let's face it, in 3 years, he could be back in the White House. So, I mean, could you address this? I mean, we just seem to be such a divided nation today, and to see agencies like the intelligence community basically involved in politics is very concerning to me and I think many millions of Americans.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. And it's some of what I want to do is just reference to what I said earlier in terms of, D.N.I. Haynes and the leaders of the intelligence community, focusing on institutionalizing those safeguards that had been in place in the intelligence community for a very long time. You always have to strengthen and reinforce the foundation. So that's what she is really focused on. That's what we're doing here in INR to make sure that we've got clear policies and guidance around, if people raise concerns about political interference. The second point I would make is that, folks in the intelligence community are of all political stripes, but you never see it in their work, and that's what makes intelligence officers. I think that's why it's such a great community to work in, because it's mission first. And people, you're working, you may work in a desk next to someone who's got very different political views, but you set that aside the minute you walk in the office, so you can really focus on the national security mission. The final point I would make is that, what happens, this is a broader point, but it's important as we think about how it impacts national security. What happens at home here in the United States has a direct impact on our ability to project power and influence abroad. And when I meet with foreign officials on trips overseas, when I've met with them, including some of our closest partners and allies, they are increasingly pointing to the divisiveness of our politics, January 6th, mass shootings, the perceived inability to get big things done in this country, and questioning whether the United States remains that shining city upon a hill. And that's important as it pertains to foreign policy and national security, because it means that, and General Brooks alluded to this a little bit, you have more nations who are hedging their bets against the power and the influence and the leadership of the United States in the global stage. And you've seen that play out a little bit in the Ukraine context, where several nations are choosing, no sides. Think about in a future conflict on a greater scale. When we need partners and allies, we need people to believe in the leadership of the United States, and I think those that question it are misplaced, and they will choose the wrong side of history. But nevertheless, the fact that you've got partners and allies, questioning that, and therefore hedging their policies and their engagement with us in ways that are maybe not hurtful, but they're certainly not helpful, I do think that's a serious issue for our country moving forward.
Let me also try to answer that directly as it relates to this issue of competition with the People's Republic of China. I've spent some time in direct conversation with Chinese interlocutors over the years and go out and travel and talk to folks in a whole range of third countries. And one of the things that you do consistently hear is that the ability of the United States to serve as a model is pretty important to how our global audiences perceive the United States. That's especially true when you've had a pretty concerted effort by actors affiliated with or that are part of the Chinese propaganda or information system, which is a specific part of the party state that deals with communications and messaging, to sort of pinpoint American vulnerabilities, weaknesses in the American governance model, and say that China can offer a more attractive alternative. So for example, in an area I look at on Chinese export of surveillance technology, the ability to pitch this as, hey, we've got a better answer to public safety and crime control than anybody else does, and it's this Huawei safe city system. Turns out the results aren't actually there, doesn't effectively control crime. We've run the math, it doesn't, the sales pitch doesn't hold up over time, but it's been pretty effective, and it's been explicitly in some cases contrasted to some of the governance failures of the United States. So things like peaceful transitions of power, equal protection of citizens under the law, the sort of fundamentals of American democracy really, I think, do matter for how we message and compete globally. And I think both General Brooks in his answer to the very first question and now Assistant Secretary Holmgren have really reinforced why that matters. The other thing I'm going to do is put our moderator on the spot because he's done a lot of work on privacy, civil liberties, and some of these questions, and how America actually has some experiences, including maybe some missteps that we've tried to learn from, and that could provide some potentially really valuable lessons. So can I put you on the spot?
Sure.
I didn't know we could ask questions. This is great.
Turnabout is fair
I'm gonna
play.
be in
That was
trouble
only a
later.
one-parter, so I can handle it. So in my previous job, one of the things that we did after the Department of Justice as Inspector General put out a series of reports on the use of FISA and some errors that had been made in Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act applications is we went to the FBI and wrestled out of them something like 24 classified FISA applications and read through all of them and lots of supporting internal FBI oversight documents to get a sense of how that process works. And then I, in my individual capacity, wrote up a bunch of recommendations that are still bouncing around the Department of Justice somewhere. But more to the point, I think one thing that we've seen from this discussion and from the Russia-Ukraine scenario is that we have this incredible national asset in our intelligence community, that we can go overseas and establish absolute intelligence dominance over the conflict in Ukraine. And if you are a Russian policymaker or military leader right now, you must be gnashing your teeth in frustration that we somehow seem to know exactly where the key players are, exactly what they plan to do, the disposition of their forces. This is an incredible asset for the United States. No one else even comes close. At the same time, these agencies in the intelligence community, not your agency, but the FBI, for example, DHS and other agencies, also have a domestic mission that touches Americans' communications, Americans' privacy, and it's this domestic mission that has kicked up an intense amount of controversy. And we have to acknowledge and understand that the loss of trust that comes out of how that domestic mission is being used ultimately weakens the foundations of the whole thing. And this is a very, very big problem for the intelligence community. I hope they realize it. I know that we have some good leaders there. Director Haynes is someone I respect a lot, and I know she understands and appreciates this. But for example, one of the biggest authorities that the intelligence community has, something called Section 702, I won't get into the weeds, but it's a very powerful collection authority, has to be reauthorized next year by Congress. If not, it will sunset and disappear. That's an authority they use to cover 200,000 foreign national targets a year. These are people overseas, not in the United States, legitimate foreign intelligence targets we are covering and getting very valuable information from. And that will go away if we don't get majorities in both houses of Congress and the president to sign off on it. Look at the state of our politics today and the discussions about intelligence. Do you think there is a strong consensus to reauthorize that? And if not, what are we going to do about it? So I appreciate the question. I don't think this is something we should brush under the rug as being too awkward, and I'm very grateful to my co-panelists for being willing to discuss it candidly, because I think we as Americans who support the work that the intelligence community is doing on core security issues need to acknowledge that this trust issue is absolutely fundamental. We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi, thank you for your time today. My name is Christopher, I'm an LBJ student. General Brooks, you mentioned that one of your top concerns was a growing sense of isolationism in the U.S. How do we approach this? Is this a political leadership thing? Is it going to take an inciting incident like a terror attack to reverse this sense of isolationism? How do we approach this?
Well, I hope that there's a recognition that what I'm saying might be true. And as we hear that, thinking about what then should we want our approach to engaging the international environment to be. And so as we talk about in academic institutions like the University of Texas, as we talk to policy leaders, as we help to inform, as we write, all these sorts of things are the ways that we begin to address that. Fundamentally, it becomes it's a matter of preference. And we've had it as a stated policy before, and it can happen again. All I'm doing is sounding off that there is great danger in doing so, in my opinion, and in the evidence of history, that it doesn't lead us to greater security, doesn't lead us to greater engagement, and we have to be mindful of that. So I think raising the call and then seeking a different alternative while keeping other matters in balance is the way to go.
Well, thank you all very much. I think we'll close on that. Before we go, I want to say thank you to a few people. First of all, to the Intelligence Studies Project, Kim Wen, Director Steve Slick, for all of the work that went into the preparation of today's event. our staff at the Strauss Center, the team at the Clements Center who have been doing an immense amount of work today preparing and running this event, and of course to our panelists, Assistant Secretary Holmgren, General Brooks, Professor Greitens, and thanks to you all for your thoughtful questions.